The condition of the nation was sick. People looked out only for themselves and for their households. And the last chapter, the last words of this part of the nation's story came to a close with these words.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes.
It was a mess. As Israel first became a nation, like these United States, they experimented with a form of government called a confederacy. Each state, each of the 12 tribes of Israel, the United States operated under what we called the Articles of Confederation as it first got going. Each state was fairly independent. There wasn't a strong central government, and so they kind of all operated on a basis of mutual cooperation. But during times of war, the idea was that God would provide a judge. Now, a judge doesn't mean somebody who's judging between, like a legal judge, but a leader, a general, to be anointed. One of the most famous was the judge named Deborah, one of the few women who was considered a leader in the ancient world. Anyway, just like the United States history under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation of Israel, it floundered and it fell. Confederations are a great idea in theory. Most of the decisions that affect people's lives directly are made closer to home. There's a lot of freedom in a confederacy to experiment in new ideas, like women in leadership. It was under the Confederacy. The problem is that historically, they just haven't lasted. Now, republics, like the United States is today under the Constitution, the republic for which the flag stands, or Rome, the Republic of Rome, before it became an empire, republics, they tend to be pretty solid. They tend to last for hundreds of years. People elect representatives at various levels, and there are checks and balances to avoid tyranny. The Republican form of government tends to be pretty solid as long as people participate. You know when a republic historically is in trouble when voting drops. When the idea of the citizen soldier gets replaced by the idea of having a professional fighting force. That was Rome. And when there are would-be Caesars who make runs at autocracy. That's the lesson of the Roman Republic. In this series, we're taking a look at then, how things were then in the history of our faith ancestors, and how things are now, how things are in some ways the same and in some ways very, very different. And we're looking for lessons, for wisdom from the past, for how we might live the days that we've got. Now, back then, the age of Confederacy came to an end. And the nation was sick. It floundered. And it fell. Now, there were still priests and holy places. They still existed in the land, but they had largely become disregarded. The religion no longer was connecting people. The Ark of the Covenant, if you're a Raiders of the Lost Ark fan, the Ark of the Covenant, that center, the thing that held the tablets of the law, it was captured and taken away for a few years. They did get it back before then they lost it altogether, but this time it got captured and taken away. And the nation's sickness continued. And it seemed it was just a matter of time before the people of Israel were conquered. So God decided to call on a child. As a boy, Samuel began his training to serve God as a priest and a prophet under the training of a man named Eli. And it was said that the word of the Lord, experiences of God, were rare in those days, and the vision for a bright future wasn't widely known. God provided Samuel to be Israel's last judge. Now, Samuel had a vision, and Samuel did hear God's voice. And Samuel led Israel effectively for many years. And he wasn't a bad judge at all, not at all. But he could not heal the moral sickness and the selfishness of the nation. Now, Samuel's sons, Joel and Abijah, they were jerks. They used their father's position as being the central person, the leader of Israel in those days, to try to turn a profit. They took bribes. They perverted justice. That's how the story goes. And no one, Samuel included, no one wanted to see those guys to become in line for leader as Samuel's days were done.
So all the Israelite elders got together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Listen, you are old now, and your sons don't follow in your footsteps. So appoint us a king to judge us like all the other nations have." It seemed very bad to Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So he prayed to the Lord. The Lord answered Samuel, "Comply with the people's request, everything they ask of you, because they haven't rejected you. No, they've rejected me as king over them. They are doing to you only what they've been doing to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this very minute, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. So comply with their request."
The United States has a very complex relationship with God. By our Constitution, we establish no religion as a national one. And all are free to worship and to pray in their own way. And yet, as we talked about last week, this nation has always had a religious influence, a religious underpinning. The idea of God is in our currency. And if on the 4th of July last week, if you do that thing where you read the Declaration of Independence, God is mentioned 5 times in the Declaration of Independence. And we're in a time right now where we're trying to sort out what that means in this time. Where Christianity, the number of people who are part of Christian communities is at the lowest point in our history. Where other religions are present as well. How do we work as a plurality in this nation? But our ancestors back then, they had no qualms. It's very different. They had no qualms about mixing religion and government. They were one in people's minds. So for Samuel to speak for God was completely acceptable to the nation's elders. But God had a warning.
"Give them a clear warning, telling them how the king will rule over them." Then Samuel explained everything the Lord had said to the people who were asking for a king. "This is how the king will rule over you," Samuel said. "He will take your sons and will use them for his chariots and his cavalry and as runners for his chariot. He will use them as his commanders of troops of 1,000 and troops of 50, or to do his plowing and his harvesting, or to make his weapons or parts for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, or bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his servants. He will give 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards to his officials and servants. He will take your male and female servants, along with the best of your cattle and donkeys, and make them do his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and then you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you chose for yourselves. But on that day, the Lord won't answer you." But the people refused to listen to Samuel and said, "No, there must be a king over us so we can be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us and lead us and fight our battles." Samuel listened to everything the people said and repeated it directly to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Comply with their request. Give them a king."
There is something inside of the human psyche that longs for a king who will just make things happen. When things get bad, we long for somebody who will take us back to the days that we felt safe, the glory days, who will lead us, who will fight our battles for us. People time and again will exchange even their freedom for that sense of security and greatness. It was true then, and it's always been true to now. There were those who called Jesus a king. Judas, his follower who betrayed him, and others, they hoped that Jesus would be the one who would redeem Israel. They were looking for the same kind of king that Samuel had been warned about. But what they got, how Jesus disappointed them, was that Jesus' teachings don't fit a worldly government. Christ's idea of the kingdom is one that can work under any kind of government, free or oppressive, because it's spiritual strength. The spiritual strength that underpins the religion of Jesus comes from its call on people and our core values: to care for others, to love others, and to work for their freedom and their well-being. And it can be subversive. It can be life-changing. But it cannot be passive. Being church is about actively using the gifts that God has given you to insist, or not to insist on gaining worldly power, but to shape and influence the powers of this world with compassion and with concern for the least of these, as Jesus said. Now, going back to then, the kings of Israel were held accountable by God's prophets. And the criteria that was used was simple. How did the poor, widows and orphans is the phrase that gets used over and over again. How do the poor, the widows and the orphans, fare under their reign? Kings were judged not by their military or their political successes, but how the least of these lived under their reign. No matter the religion or the government, God's concern was then and is now for a world where all have enough. Keep looking over at those things there and saying, all of us. And that brings us back to our Messiah greeting and the wisdom that's behind it. The Messiah, known for their great warriors, But behind the power of the warrior comes the wisdom that the viability of the people, of their people, of any nation, is how are the children doing? That is the question that God has asked every nation in every time and place. How are the children? And not how my children are, or your kids, but how are our kids? All of the children. How are the children? When 16 million of them in our land live in poverty, and our leaders bicker about food programs. How are the children when 10,000 children die every year to gun violence, including suicide with a rate that is going up? How are the children? How are the children when children, mostly little girls, 300,000, are sex trafficked in America, with Kansas City being the epicenter? How are the children being separated from their parents in tender care centers? How are the children of Flint, Michigan, and Standing Rock, where the very water that they drink may kill them? How are the children who live without health care and their families teeter on the precipice while politicians have debated for years about while they have the best health care plans in the nation?
People brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and pray for them, but the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Then he placed his hands on them.
What if our leaders promised not to hinder the well-being and the opportunities for abundant life for all children? What if the question, how are the children, is how we measure the effectiveness of our leaders? Because it is how God, both back then and throughout time and now, does. It was how the kings were evaluated. How did the poorest children fare under their reign? God's concern has not changed, nor will it. And Christ's church is called by God to shape and influence worldly power, to ask our leaders and ourselves this vital question: how are the children? Will you pray with me? Lord, our children are not all well. We have fallen back into a time when each looks out for their own. But you did send us a king, a new kind of king. One who does not heal all our sicknesses himself, but he tells his followers to get out there and do it. Work for the kingdom of God on this earth as it is in heaven. To be good news to the children. To love compassionately all God's children. This is what it means to be church. And though we may not be mighty in numbers, we can be mighty in spirit, because you are with us. No matter what should come, may we always be your church. Amen.